It was kind of interesting to put this in retrospective, just to kind of cover my history in this field. I've been around from a cybersecurity perspective for almost 30 years now, 25 of which in the professional domain. I really got my start as a researcher that was a hacker, a combination of a computer scientist and a political scientist with a focus on national security studies. And I had this idea that our dependence on information technology and the inherent vulnerability in that technology represented a new national security risk. That was kind of the catalyst for my career over the years that resulted in me working in a lot of these different companies, including as being a founder of multiple of them over the past 25 years. Interestingly, I was able to write my graduate thesis on the topic for those that are interested in the history aspect, and that's kind of what this talk is intended to be, a look at some of the historical elements. I did a 25-year retrospective. I mentioned in 1995, I published my graduate thesis called National Security in the Information Age. And I went back and looked and saw, just how much did I get right and how much has changed or not changed over the past 25 years. And it makes for a very, very interesting analysis. Another document that I'm quite well known for that I wrote with colleagues Neil Pollard, who's now the global CISO at UBS, and Brian Houghton, was a paper called Information Terrorism, Can You Trust Your Toaster? It was the first peer-reviewed, was in the Georgetown Journal, look at the risk that was represented from a cyber terrorism perspective. We also looked at critical infrastructure protection and other things. So the start of my career was really this 1995 when I got pulled into the Department of Defense and was asked to build a red team that would go and have legal authority to look at any systems in the DoD, classified or unclassified. So if you're a small town kid from Vermont who hasn't had a large opportunity to travel, that turns out to be a great gig because it turns out the Department of Defense is everywhere. And then coming out of that red team, I was asked to put together a proposal to run a coalition. We called it a vulnerability assessment team, but really what we did was act as the red team during coalition military exercises. Those are Five Eyes type exercises. Interestingly, we had all of these great generals that were retired that were being brought in to run the red forces, were given military equipment and some of the real world type simulations, but we hadn't addressed the cyber component. And I was kind of the squeaky wheel that got the grease, talking about the need for understanding how our adversaries would target us in the cyber domain, and that led to the formation of that team. Now, kind of on the catalyst that from a red teaming perspective, we wanted to look at how the plans came together with regards to the coalition networks connecting, sharing classified data, and how that would survive contact with the enemy. One of my favorite quotes here on the screen, no plan survives contact with the enemy. In reality, I think Mike Tyson said it a little bit better, in that everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And that was kind of the perspective. We were playing that live sparring partner. And really the reality was that we were looking to see where the security implementation did not match the security aspirations. So we saw, even back in those days, people wanting to do the right thing for the most part, wanting to connect these systems securely, wanting to secure the components that were on these networks, but then the real world implementation was really lacking. We also wanted to bring the offense back into the equation. This is another favorite quote of mine: the defense without offense is the art of losing slowly. So not only was this the time frame, 1995 to 2000, in which these red teams were getting kicked off, but it was also the catalyst for thinking about offensive cyber as well. So if we revert, we think 1995, what was significant in my perspective, the first DoD red team was stood up. We had the coalition vulnerability assessment team that I mentioned. You had eligible receiver, which is a body of work now available on that, was a classified military exercise to try and move from unclassified networks to classified networks that was successful. And the state of the art really was a manual process. I mean, all of the red teaming that we were doing was very, very heavy, hands-on keyboards. There was the emergence of tools in the space that automated a little bit of that process. I know with my red team, I had licenses for Internet Security Scanner, Ballista Scanner, if anybody remembers the Ballista team out of Canada back in the 90s, of course, Satan and Saint. But really, these were, to a certain extent, automation tools in kind of the very truest sense. They automated manual tasks, but didn't do much beyond that. We also saw the emergence of kind of the professionalization of red teaming. A good friend of mine in the early 90s had started one of the first commercial red teams. And towards the end of 1999, I came on to be the director of operations with him at a company called Security Design International. And that was really taking the red teaming perspective and starting to apply it to commercial targets and moving it outside the realm of DoD. SDI was just one of a number of companies that were operating in that space at the time, but the market wasn't fully emerged. Other thing that was interesting was the emergence of the threat intelligence industry. I had gotten to work on the President's Commission on Critical Infrastructure Protection, which led to PDD 63, which called for the formation of the ISACs. And we started talking back then about what if we didn't wait for the government? What if we started doing private cybersecurity or cyber threat intelligence? And that resulted in me being one of the founding employees of iDefense, which produced one of the first commercial cyber threat intelligence reports. And to put that into context, when I was selling that product in the market in 1999, there was one person in the world that had the title of CISO. So if we go back, a little over 20 years ago and just think that the title of CISO really didn't exist, there was one person that had that on their business card back then. The biggest lesson learned that I had coming out of those red teams that I was running, we got to do a lot of firsts, so it attracted a lot of attention. So it was really good as a catalyst for raising awareness, getting people to understand. I've got a ton of just fascinating stories that I can share over drinks about hacking into systems on an aircraft carrier while it was at sea in a nuclear submarine, the head of SOCOM having a one-character password, just all sorts of fun things that we were encountering. But then the key thing, the key lesson learned when I kind of distilled what we did over that red team and the operation of the CVAT over the course of the 3 years was that tools are not talent. What I really longed for and was trying to develop within that community was the talent that could actually engage in red teaming. And you'll see that thematic kind of emerge and change over the years as we look at it. So if we move past 1995 to 2000, start thinking about 2000 to 2010, obviously there was a great deal of attention focused in the early 2000s based on the September 11th attacks on what I'll call kind of the hybrid threat, terrorism plus physical security. Also this realization, and not a lot that we can talk about in this domain, that we could start to use information operations to target bad guys, whether they be terrorists or others, right? So starting to see the dual use component in these environments as well. Still in the 2000s to 2010s, I like to say it was a red teamer's paradise. Everything was still pretty vulnerable. I operated with a 100% success rate from a red teaming perspective for 23 years. So, back in the 2000s, we're looking at a lot more targets, a lot more commercial companies coming into play, but everything was still inherently pretty vulnerable, even to what we would consider today to be some pretty simple attacks. Start to see the emergence of other tools in the market as well. Metasploit, Nessus went proprietary / commercial during that time frame. But then I also feel like one thing that we lost touch with during that time period was the focus on the adversary perspective, on understanding what it is that the bad guys are targeting and why they're targeting it. And I think it was just because we were so overrun with opportunity from a vulnerability perspective. There were so many things were vulnerable. Some of these networks were so easy to compromise that we really didn't think about adversary intent or TTP or things that would come into play at a later date as well. Still in late 2008, I was getting this inkling that things were going to start changing drastically. In fact, in 2008, at the end of the year, I put out a blog post that I entitled that 2009 would be the year of living cyber dangerously. And I really just felt like we were seeing this momentum. Things were still fairly vulnerable. Security hadn't quite caught up, wasn't being given the support that was required at the board of directors, at the executive level. Sure, people were spending money, but they didn't quite understand or were able to contextualize the risks associated with what we were doing. And that led me to believe that things were going to change drastically, that the nature of the threat was going to change drastically, and that our initiatives in this space were going to change drastically. So that 2000s timeframe, obviously September 11th being a huge influence there in applying some of the CT focus and people starting to think about how would you blend cyber and terror? Could you use cyber attacks in order to augment or increase the impact of a physical attack? Engaged in multiple red teams against public transit authorities, did stuff for the FAA against the national airspace. We were really looking at some of that blended piece. How do you cause maximum physical consequence by using cyber attack against some of these targets? It was an important dialogue for us to have, but I think it kind of overemphasized the terrorist aspect of the cyber threat, kind of to the detriment of some of the other threat actors that existed out there. In coming to this realization, this is a quote, my good friend Jay Healy and I argue as to who originated it, but this recognition that your attacker is not a 1 or a 0. Again, we were very focused on kind of the technical aspects, what was vulnerable, what tools could you run, and we lost track of that human piece, and recognizing that at the end of the keyboard, at the end of the, even if somebody wrote it from a malicious program and it had some autonomy to it, there was some sort of intent. There was an attacker that had a goal or had an objective, and we needed to bring that back into the equation. And of course, it calls to mind as well the Sun Tzu quote, "To know your enemy, you must become your enemy." So tailing into the 2010 timeframe, we have the emergence of advanced persistent threat in the dialogue. And Greg Rattray is a good friend, and read his book and was visiting him when he was at the White House, and recognized that he kind of used that term APT long before we started using it in the cybersecurity industry. But I really feel like it was the 2010 Google Aurora attacks that really is what started to shift the surface and change the game. I had worked at that point in time, 2010, let's call it 50 to 60 different incidents over the course of that tenure, things ranging from Solar Sunrise and Moonlight Maze on the government side to working with large commercial entities that had suffered a breach. And the common perspective was that breaches were something that you didn't disclose. You didn't go back and relive, the issue that Citibank had when it disclosed its breach and the successful capture that people had stolen $10 million and competitors were using that as a differentiator against them in the market. So what we had was a lot of attacks taking place, but not a lot of public knowledge. I mean, some of the information being shared amongst the cyber threat intelligence community being anonymized, but really the Google disclosure, I felt like cracked open from that perspective, the disclosure of these attackers that were operating against commercial companies. It's also the time frame in which we start to bring the threat back into the equation. I like to call the formation of FusionX, my red teaming company in 2010, as my back to the future company. It wasn't that we invented something that was entirely new. I was doing adversary-based red teaming in 1995, 6, 7, 98. But what we were doing was bringing that back into focus, primarily in the commercial sector, right? So adversary impersonation, doing the red teaming as a simulation, operationalizing the attacks, which allowed us to do something else that was really important, I feel, from this perspective, and that was bring the business context into the equation. I mentioned in the 2000s, we had this issue of business not quite comprehending the risk or understanding what was at risk. And I feel like 2010 to 2020 is the time frame in which the hackers got to the boardroom. I briefed more boards of directors in that time frame than I ever had in my life. They were starting to recognize the importance the red team played, and they were starting to recognize the business impact implications associated with this. I'll give you one example, in briefing the executives from a very large public company, asked them where cyber fell on their list of risks that they were identifying, and it was actually number 7. So they had 6 other risks that they had identified to the business that were more consequential than a cyber attack. And then I shifted the conversation and said, okay, well, what are the 3 things that could happen to your business that would be the most consequential? So I would say consequential or catastrophic. Right? Consequential means that you've got to disclose them in your quarterly report. Catastrophic means it impacts your potential to remain in business. And they gave me 3 examples. And we went and worked with the CISO and ran red team exercises where we demonstrated that we could accomplish all 3 of those objectives. And that resulted in cyber risk moving from number 7 on the board's list to number 1. So this is the time frame in which we start to be able to contextualize the impact and normalize red teaming and some of this offensive perspective as having high value in these enterprise networks. One thing that I did also notice during this time frame is we started as an industry to get into over specialization, and I particularly noticed this with folks that I was interviewing that were coming out of the government, where they understood a very small piece of the kill chain, but didn't understand how to string things together overall. And that for me was, a little bit of disconcerting in that regard. And also the fact that we seem to have tools for everything. There's almost an oversaturation of tools, or you could run into what I would call kind of tool inertia, where you'd have a hard time trying to figure out what to use, because from a red teaming perspective, there were all of these scripts and exploits and things that were available. So while we achieved a lot of great things and we brought the adversary back into the equation, we were able to get the business context in place. Still some significant issues, I think, from an industry perspective that we need to conquer 2020 and beyond. The kind of the lessons and, appropriately themed with the unicorns is that the mindset aspect of this is critical. I'm going to speak to that a little bit more as well. And the ability to develop expertise that is focused on what are the emerging issues, not only in technology, but from a business perspective, right? We all need to be keeping track of what are the latest exploits, latest ways in which we can attack things. But we also need to understand the context of how communication is changing, about how business is changing, new tools that are going to be used like machine learning and the emergence of AI, and understanding that context as well, right? We need to make sure that we are experts, not in a past version of the world, but that we're able to adapt and apply that expertise in the future as well. So 2020 and beyond, one lesson learned, and I kind of cheated and forward a couple of these from, late 18, 19 into 2020. We've got this broad realization that we can't scale the human workforce. And that is especially true when it comes to engaging in offensive security testing and red teaming. It is very difficult to scale to the extent that the requirement exists, the workforce needed in order to conduct those attacks. Also, that what we needed were not just tools that automate, but that could also be augment the red team. So that is kind of like a workforce enablement, right? Is there a tool that I can provide a red teamer that lets them act like 3 red teamers instead of 1? Is there elements of what a red teamer is doing that can be augmented, not just automated? And the difference between the two for me is the augmentation brings some context with it, whereas the automation doesn't, right? It's just a rinse and repeat process based. And that was what caused me to be interested in having a conversation with Bryce and becoming an investor in Scythe. Here I was, this red teamer who was sworn to the fact that human red teamers are the best, recognizing that there was a piece of this process where we could take the human out of the equation, or we could give the humans tools to do as well a job, but with that level of augmentation and automation that needed to exist. We've got to reconcile with the fact that autonomy is emerging as well, and not being so hesitant to incorporate some of that into our tooling. And I know it's dangerous territory when we talk about offensive security in autonomy, but we need to be having those conversations and thinking about that and getting community value by getting a little bit more lift from the tools and things that we're developing in the community with initiatives like Marketplace in order to enable us to kind of keep pace. Because there's one thing that I can guarantee is that the real attackers are going to be developing some autonomous software, and we're going to need it on the defense side, and we're going to need it in the red teaming environment. I also feel like the tool environment is great for capturing what I would call the learning data that will allow us achieve a little bit of that autonomy. Anybody who's ever engaged in red teaming with really talented hackers knows that documenting the process and the way in which things happened can be incredibly challenging. So if we're looking for a way in which to augment that skill or to develop some tools that have some autonomous capability there, becomes difficult because we don't have the training data. So what I like about bringing some of the capability into platforms is that we can actually record and analyze that data to allow for machine learning and further autonomy in the future. So that's an area that I get excited about. Any time where we can bring into play some factor that allows us to capture some of that institutional organizational knowledge, I think that becomes important as well. And I feel like in that perspective, we're marching towards an environment where the humans are going to be needed for the strategy, understanding the adversary intent, and they're going to be needed for some of the innovation, right? How do we develop some of the new exploits, or how do we overcome something that is a barrier within our path? Those still become very human-dependent tools, but that the machine can kind of be the middleware, right? That gets to be the frosting in the Oreo cookie, where it's able to engage in a lot of the work. So we start to view the humans as kind of the bookends in that process. They have to have the creativity to do the campaign planning, and they need to bring the innovation where we have the challenges or need to develop the exploit environment to a certain extent. But there's quite a bit in the middle that can be augmented and automated through tools that are able to mimic that red teaming process. The essential challenge, of course, becomes that people hire red teamers from a couple of perspectives. The first is they want that sparring partner. I had the Mike Tyson slide earlier on. If you were going to be fighting Mike Tyson, and it seemed like that was a little bit of a stale slide, but it seems like he's coming back into the public domain a little bit. But if I were fighting Mike Tyson, how would I train for that fight? Would I train for that fight by hitting a static punching bag and shadow boxing, or would I train with somebody who is a human live sparring partner? So the red teamers provide that live sparring partner for our blue teams. Some of that needs to be collaborative, thus the emergence of the purple team concept over the past few years. But then the other essential challenge is, as you're engaging in that sparring, is always having an eye on how we out-innovate the adversary. I always tell the red teamers that I work with is that one of their core functions is to try and figure out where the attacker is going to innovate next and get there first, so that we can help our clients exercise defenses against that, or at least understand the risk implications of it. Another key piece too is I think we tend to view red teaming as part of the end process or end state. You build a network and you red team against it, you build a product. And to be successful, we really need to bring the red teaming perspective into the design process. And some organizations are better than that than others, but it's still very critical, right? So it becomes where red teaming needs to be a continuous effort, not something that you do once a quarter or once a year, and thus the need for some of these tools that are going to help us automate and augment that process is that we can be in this cycle of doing continuous red teaming the same way that we think about continuous monitoring, and get there very early. Famously, many years ago, went to do a red team for a commercial satellite provider. As somebody who's going to be providing IP services over satellite communication. We went and met with a team. We wrote the proposal. We went in for verbals. We actually won. We went and had the kickoff meeting. We walked away with 800 pages worth of documentation. Came back a couple weeks later and said, all right, we're ready to bang against this thing in the lab. Where are you going to point us? And the head of security for the company says, what do you mean in the lab? What are you talking about? So, well, you hired us to do the red team against this. We need to get some access to the actual satellite. And he said, oh, no, you don't understand. The satellite's already in space. So we went through this whole process where we thought we were assessing something before it gets launched. They already had put it in space, and trying to get them to understand that the impact that we could have on the security of that satellite was greatly diminished by the fact that the thing was already in space, right? Maybe not so much an issue with the emergence of SpaceX and commercial technology. Maybe we can get a hacker up there, but it was an interesting lesson learned that people tend to think about red teaming in the context of as a closeout as opposed to a continuous part of the process. Adaptability I talked about, as a core tenet. And then the other one too is applying red teaming concepts to new domains. And this is something that I've been talking about for quite some time. I have a concept I call HACKthink, where if you're a really good red teamer, we should be thinking about how we apply red teaming concepts to other domains of business, society, et cetera, in order to bring maximum value. There's just some inherent value there. A couple of things. I did do a keynote at the B-Sides Nova a couple of years ago where I talked through 20 lessons learned over 20 years of red teaming. So the link is there. If you just search Matt Devost B-Sides, you come up with it as well. I'll make sure that these links get circulated. And that was resulting from a post that I wrote in 2015. There was 10 lessons learned from 20 years of red teaming. So if you're interested in kind of the lessons learned as opposed to the perspective on the industry and where it's gone and some of the lessons that we've learned, I definitely would encourage you to check out those two. And in that same regard, I always get asked, are there books that we should be reading that kind of put into context where we've come from and where we're going? Here are some that I like to talk not only about the historical, but talk about some of the recent events. And then also talk about some of the emerging issues, right? If you want to think about what are we going to be red teaming against in the future, you'd read something like Ghost Fleet, but lots of great historical and detailed context in these books. So I'll make sure that you have access to those as well. That's all I had by way of formal remarks. So I'll revert back to the cam. And I don't know, Bryson, how you're handling this for Q&A.
So we had one question come in. You stated that we over-focused on terrorism early on in your career and that the industry shouldn't have done so. How do we, the industry, identify when we are in the process of overemphasizing a threat, product, or category?
Yeah, that's great. One thing that I've been a huge proponent of over the past several years is engaging what I call macro level threat modeling. So to make sure that you look at, from the perspective of multiple different adversaries and categories of adversaries, a threat model that focuses on what the impact could be to your organization. Are the adversaries targeting you? What controls that you have in place? How effective are those controls? How would the adversary need to innovate to get beyond those controls? And make sure that it's a comprehensive process. I think we do tend to focus on, the last person that hit us becomes the priority. The last person that hit our peer or competitor, the last person we read about in the New York Times. And I think to really understand that threat context and how to contextualize the threat, we need to be doing that macro level threat modeling across a whole bunch of different classes of adversaries. I felt like, and this is from my perspective as well, I was running the Terrorism Research Center on September 11th. So obviously that was a huge focus. But I saw that across the industry, right? It was a lot of cyber terrorism scenarios that emerged and maybe didn't position us as well for the state-sponsored attackers who are always there behind the scenes, but hadn't really been publicly discussed and disclosed until the 2010 timeframe.